This is a glass of water. In Dhaka, Bangladesh, it costs roughly 2 taka from a municipal tap, less than a penny. Sounds almost free until you realize that this same glass required water to travel 1,200 kilometers from the Himalayan glaciers through the Ganges and Brahmaputra river systems, past 47 Indian dams and diversion projects, before reaching the tap of someone in the world's most densely populated nation. That journey used to be guaranteed by geography. Rivers flow downhill. Gravity doesn't negotiate. But on December 12, 2025, India's Ministry of Jal Shakti quietly approved Phase 3 of the National River Linking Project, a $168 billion infrastructure program that will physically redirect 174 billion cubic meters of water annually from rivers that flow into Bangladesh to rivers that stay within India. This is not a dam. This is not a reservoir. This is the hydrological equivalent of changing the address on 30% of Bangladesh's freshwater supply and telling 180 million people to find it somewhere else. The document is 2,400 pages. The international press covered the announcement in exactly 3 paragraphs. But buried in Appendix 14C is a timeline showing the Ganges Diversion Canal reaching operational capacity by March 2028. After that date, the water that has sustained Bengali civilization for 4,000 years will arrive at the border only when India decides to release it. Here's what they're not telling you. Bangladesh receives approximately 1.1 trillion cubic meters of surface water annually. Of that, 92% originates outside the country's borders, making Bangladesh the most water-dependent nation on Earth by a factor of 3. The Ganges alone provides 54% of dry season agricultural water to the country's southern regions, where 80 million people grow rice on land that has been cultivated since before the Mughal Empire. India's National River Linking Project changes this equation through pure infrastructure physics. By connecting the Ganges to the Kaveri, the Brahmaputra to the Mahanadi, and a dozen other rivers through a 15,000-kilometer network of canals, India gains the ability to redirect water from surplus basins to deficit basins entirely within its own territory. The project's stated goal is drought mitigation in Rajasthan, Maharashtra, and Tamil Nadu, states that collectively hold 350 million Indian voters. The unstated consequence is that Bangladesh loses control over its own hydrological survival. At 6:30 a.m. Delhi time on January 3, 2026, satellite imagery from Planet Labs captured construction activity at the Farakka Barrage, the existing dam that already diverts Ganges water into India's Hooghly River. The imagery showed excavation equipment preparing foundations for what engineers identified as intake structures for the new Ken-Betwa link canal. This canal will pull water from the Ganges system 400 kilometers upstream of the Bangladesh border before it ever reaches the Farakka gates. The official position of India's Ministry of External Affairs is that all transboundary water sharing will continue under the 1996 Ganges Water Treaty. But that treaty only covers flows at Farakka itself. It says nothing about water that never reaches Farakka, because it's been diverted upstream through infrastructure that didn't exist when the treaty was signed. This is the legal equivalent of promising to share the pie while building a kitchen that lets you eat most of it before it reaches the table. This is where the lie becomes unsustainable. The physics of river systems create what hydrologists call committed flow, water that must arrive at certain points for downstream ecosystems to survive. For the Ganges Delta, committed flow is approximately 35,000 cubic feet per second during the dry season. Below that threshold, saltwater intrusion from the Bay of Bengal penetrates inland, contaminating aquifers and killing crops. The 1996 treaty attempted to guarantee this minimum by specifying flow-sharing percentages at Farakka. During the driest months, Bangladesh receives 35% of whatever water passes the barrage. But percentages are meaningless if the absolute volume drops. 35% of a diminished flow can still fall below the survival threshold. India's river linking project will reduce Ganges flow at Farakka by an estimated 40 to 55% during dry season months, according to modeling by the Bangladesh Water Development Board. Even if India honors the treaty's percentage allocations perfectly, the absolute volume reaching Bangladesh will fall below committed flow requirements for 3 to 4 months annually. The agricultural implications are straightforward. 4 million hectares of rice paddy will become unsustainable without irrigation supplementation that Bangladesh cannot afford to provide. The aquifer implications are worse. Once saltwater contaminates a freshwater lens, the geological damage persists for decades. The human implications are catastrophic. 30 to 40 million climate refugees within a nation that has nowhere for them to go. For every cubic meter of water that India diverts, Bangladesh loses not just that water, but the ecosystem services that water provided: floodplain replenishment, sediment transport, fishery sustenance, and groundwater recharge. The multiplier effect means that a 40% reduction in surface flow translates to a 60 to 70% reduction in agricultural productivity across the affected regions. Paper treaties cannot override physical water scarcity. Diplomatic promises cannot make rivers flow uphill. When institutions do this, they're not managing risk, they're containing disaster. On December 28, 2025, the World Bank's South Asia Water Initiative held an emergency consultation in Singapore, not Washington, not Delhi, not Dhaka, Singapore. The location was chosen specifically because it falls outside the political sensitivities of the affected parties. No official minutes have been released, but sources present described the meeting as the most pessimistic assessment of subcontinental water security since partition. 3 days later, the Asian Development Bank quietly revised its 2026 Bangladesh Infrastructure Lending Program. The original allocation of $2.1 billion for transportation and energy projects was restructured to include $800 million for emergency water security measures, desalination pilot plants, deep aquifer drilling, and rainwater capture systems that Bangladesh has never needed before, because river water was always available. The IMF's January 2026 Bangladesh Article 4 consultation, a routine annual review, was extended from 3 days to 11 days. The extended timeline allowed IMF economists to model scenarios that the Bangladeshi government had requested remain confidential: agricultural collapse cascades, internal displacement projections, and the fiscal impact of food imports replacing domestic production. Less than 90 days remain before the 2026 dry season reaches its peak. When it does, the first full year of reduced Ganges flow will test whether the 1996 treaty's percentage guarantees translate to survival-level water delivery. Early hydrology data suggests they will not. The Farakka outflow measurements for January 1 through 15, 2026, averaged 31,200 cubic feet per second, already 11% below the committed flow threshold, and the driest months are still 6 weeks away. India's Central Water Commission has attributed the reduction to below normal monsoon precipitation in the upper basin. But satellite precipitation data from NASA's iMerge system shows 2025 monsoon rainfall at 97% of the 30-year average, essentially normal. The water is not missing, it's being held. The last time India unilaterally restricted Ganges flow was during the 1975-1977 period, before any water-sharing treaty existed. The agricultural collapse that followed contributed to the 1974 Bangladesh famine, which killed an estimated 1.5 million people. That famine was attributed to flooding, but hydrologists later demonstrated that upstream water management had disrupted the entire deltaic ecosystem, causing crop failures that had nothing to do with the floods themselves. History does not repeat, but infrastructure does. The mechanisms that enabled the 1974 catastrophe have been rebuilt at 10 times the scale. While one side builds dams, the other side watches the water disappear. China's position in this crisis is precisely calibrated ambiguity. The Brahmaputra, called the Yarlung Tsangpo in Tibet, originates on the Chinese plateau before flowing through India and into Bangladesh. China has constructed 6 dams on the upper Brahmaputra since 2015, with 3 more under construction. These dams give Beijing the same leverage over India that India now holds over Bangladesh. The strategic geometry is elegant and terrifying. If India restricts Ganges flow to Bangladesh, Bangladesh has no recourse. It has no upstream leverage. But if India restricts flow too aggressively, China can respond by restricting Brahmaputra flow to India, creating a cascading water crisis that punishes Indian agriculture in the northeast. This is why India's river linking project includes the Brahmaputra-Ganga Link Canal, a 670-kilometer channel that would transfer Brahmaputra water to the Ganges basin. The official justification is flood control in Assam. The strategic reality is that India is trying to reduce its dependence on Chinese-controlled water by diversifying its sources before China can weaponize them. The water that India takes from Bangladesh via the Ganges system will be partially replaced by water that India takes from China via the Brahmaputra system. The net effect is that Bangladesh bears the full cost of India's strategic repositioning against China. Beijing has not commented publicly on India's river linking project, but on January 8, 2026, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Liu Jianchao responded to a question about transboundary water management by noting that all riparian states have a sovereign right to develop water resources within their territory, consistent with their development needs. This language precisely mirrors India's own justification for the river linking project, and puts Beijing on record supporting the principle that upstream nations can do whatever they want. The diplomatic message is clear. China will not help Bangladesh, but China will remember how India behaves when the roles are reversed on the Brahmaputra. This is not about water rights between two nations. This is about the emergence of water as a strategic weapon in a three-player game where the smallest player has no moves. The mathematics of the trap are now inescapable. Bangladesh has three theoretical options for responding to Indian water diversion, and all three are inadequate. Option 1. Legal challenge. Bangladesh could invoke the 1997 UN Watercourses Convention, which establishes principles of equitable utilization for transboundary rivers. But India never ratified the convention and does not recognize its jurisdiction. Bangladesh could file a case with the International Court of Justice, but ICJ rulings are not self-enforcing, and India has previously ignored ICJ judgments it considered adverse to its interests. Option 2. Infrastructure adaptation. Bangladesh could build desalination plants, drill deeper wells, and construct water recycling systems to reduce dependence on surface flow. But the capital requirements exceed $50 billion over 10 years, equivalent to 15% of Bangladesh's current GDP. The country's debt-to-GDP ratio is already 39% and rising. No plausible financing scenario exists that would allow Bangladesh to replace river water with engineered alternatives before the crisis arrives. Option 3. Population redistribution. Bangladesh could encourage migration from the water-stressed south to the relatively water-secure north, reducing demand in the affected regions. But the population density of Bangladesh is already 1,265 people per square kilometer, the highest of any non-city-state nation on Earth. There is no empty land to absorb 30 to 40 million internal refugees. Every relocation creates a new crisis at the destination. The Indian calculation is that Bangladesh will choose option 4, accept reduced water access and adapt through agricultural transformation, economic restructuring, and permanent dependence on Indian goodwill for survival-level resources. This is not water sharing. This is water vassalage. And the leverage this creates extends far beyond water. A Bangladesh that depends on India for hydrological survival cannot oppose Indian trade policies, cannot align with China on regional security, cannot support Pakistan in diplomatic disputes, and cannot resist Indian influence in domestic politics. Water becomes the mechanism for converting a sovereign nation into a client state. Petrodollar leverage built American hegemony in the Middle East. Water leverage will build Indian hegemony in South Asia. The playbook is identical, only the resource has changed. This is what a system looks like when every response accelerates the outcome it's trying to prevent. Bangladesh's protests against the river linking project strengthen Indian domestic support for the project by framing it as a sovereignty issue. International pressure on India triggers nationalist backlash that makes compromise politically impossible. Climate change acceleration increases Indian water stress, making diversion more necessary even as it becomes more destructive. And Bangladeshi economic decline reduces the country's capacity to adapt, making it more vulnerable to the very crisis it's trying to avoid. There is no exit that preserves the status quo. By 2030, either Bangladesh will have surrendered effective sovereignty over its water supply, or the humanitarian crisis will have grown severe enough to force international intervention that neither India nor Bangladesh can control. The 1947 partition of British India created two water-dependent nations from one integrated hydrological system. The 2025 river linking project completes the severance, not through war, but through infrastructure that makes war unnecessary. The informed are not waiting for official announcements to understand what's happening. Agricultural commodities markets have already priced in Bangladeshi production uncertainty. Rice futures on the Dhaka Commodity Exchange show 18% backwardation through 2027, meaning buyers are willing to pay significant premiums for guaranteed delivery because they don't trust future supply. The Bangladeshi taka has depreciated 12% against the Indian rupee since the river linking announcement, reflecting capital flight toward the stronger water position. Land prices in Bangladesh's northern Sylhet division, the region least affected by Ganges-dependent agriculture, have increased 34% in the past 6 months. Wealthy Bangladeshis are repositioning assets toward water-secure geography before the crisis makes such repositioning impossible. The poor, as always, will remain where they are until the water stops coming. Meanwhile, Singapore, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia have accelerated investments in vertical farming, desalination, and water recycling technologies. These nations understand that water scarcity is not a regional problem. It's a preview of planetary conditions that will eventually affect everyone. The technologies developed to survive South Asian water stress will become the infrastructure of a water-constrained world. Gold purchases by Bangladeshi households have increased 40% year over year, according to the Bangladesh Jewelers Association. This is not investment behavior. This is insurance behavior, converting paper assets denominated in taka into physical assets that retain value regardless of currency collapse, agricultural failure, or political instability. The premium on physical gold over paper contracts in South Asian markets has widened to 4.1%, the highest since the 2020 pandemic panic. Dealers in Dhaka report 2-month waiting lists for delivery. The market for atoms is separating from the market for digits because atoms cannot be diverted by upstream infrastructure. The question is not whether Bangladesh faces an existential water crisis. The question is, who understands that crisis well enough to position for its consequences? 180 million people live in a nation whose survival depends on the decisions of a neighbor that has decided to prioritize its own development over their existence. This is not a prediction of what might happen. This is a description of infrastructure already under construction, treaties already being circumvented, and water already being held behind dams that didn't exist a decade ago. The Ganges has flowed to the sea for millions of years. It has sustained civilizations for millennia. And now, for the first time in geological history, that flow is being redirected by human infrastructure on a scale that changes the fundamental hydrology of an entire subcontinent. Physics doesn't negotiate. Rivers don't respect treaties, and reality eventually asserts itself over every system that tries to deny it. The divergence between paper agreements and physical water has begun. What happens next is not prediction, it's gravity.